I've gotten some questions recently about the dramatic fall in the money velocity and what it means. It's an interesting topic, so let's do a deep dive and discuss what the data will tell us about what's going on in this crazy economy of ours. What I'm showing you here is money velocity data I pulled from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Data Bank. Some of you will already know what money velocity means, but probably many of you don't. So before getting too much into the analysis, let's discuss some definitions. Money velocity is not something that is measured. It's a variable that's calculated mathematically from two other basic bits of information that are measured. The first of these being the total amount of transactions in the United States in a given year, otherwise known as the gross domestic product, or GDP for short. The second is the total amount of money in existence. Now, as an aside, it would be more correct to call it credit in existence, but since modern economists call it money, we'll use that term interchangeably, as incorrect as it is. In this presentation, we'll use the broad measure of money, M2, which is a combination of savings deposits, checking deposits, and very short-term time deposits and credit. It's basically all instruments that can be quickly mobilized to purchase goods and services. The velocity of the M2 money supply is simply the total volume of transactions divided by the total stock of M2 money. On this graph here, I show you an example. The velocity of M2, most recently, is the GDP of $17.6 trillion per year divided by the $11.6 trillion M2 money stock, which gives us a velocity of 1.52. Now, I've mentioned that the money velocity is a calculated term. So why do modern economists bother to calculate it at all? Well, it's because they believe that the calculation provides some type of insight into what's happening inside the economy. I will show in a moment why blindly applying the Keynesian measures can result in misleading conclusions, but for now, let's discuss what the economists in general take the money velocity to mean. Simply speaking, it's the number of times per year the money turns over. It is the circulation rate of money in the economy. So if one simply looks at this chart and takes the information at face value, one could come to a very disturbing but wrong conclusion. Don't worry, there is a very disturbing conclusion to be drawn, and I'll be getting to that later, but it's not going to come from this chart. What this chart suggests is that the velocity of money in the economy gradually increased from 1965 to 1987, and then afterward increased by quite a bit up to the year 1997, when it peaked and then started a slow decline. Once we reached the year 2008, the velocity of money started plummeting quickly, and now stands at the lowest levels it's been in the past 50 years. On the surface, this would look like a very disturbing trend because it suggests that the money flow in the economy is slowing down to a crawl. But let's dig deeper. First, we'll need to reconstruct this chart so that we can make some adjustments, which I'm sure you'll agree will make some sense. So going to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Data Bank, we can pull up some data for US GDP and the total M2 money stock. I'm only going back to 1985 here because some of the data that I'll need to make my adjustments is only available from 1985 onward. Anyway, if this data is correct, we should be able to reconstruct the money velocity chart simply by dividing the GDP numbers by the M2 money stock. Let's see what happens when we do so. We see that we get a pretty good match. The white curve here is the original money velocity chart that I pulled from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Data Bank. The red curve is my calculation of money velocity as determined by dividing the GDP by the money stock. So why did I go through the trouble of doing this calculation? Well, it has to do with a deficiency in the M2 money measurement. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Okay, here I show the GDP curve in white on the chart as before. The other curves represent measures of money quantity. Notice I've included a green curve at the bottom of the chart. This green curve represents what the Federal Reserve is calling excess reserves on deposit. Quite simply, it's the amount of cash held in the banking system in excess of what is required to be held at a minimum. It is money that the Federal Reserve System has created that's not being lent out, either because the banks are refusing to lend it or because the private sector is just not borrowing. In either event, it's money that's not circulating. It is as if the Federal Reserve has created it and the banks have just stuffed it under the mattress. But being cash, it is included in the M2 money supply. For the purposes of calculating money velocity, it really shouldn't be there because it's not available for circulation. In the middle of the graph, I show two curves. One is a red curve showing the M2 money supply supplied by the Federal Reserve Data Bank. This is the same data that we used in our previous calculation. I also include a blue curve, which is the same M2 money data, but it has the excess reserves subtracted from it. This blue curve we can think of as the actual portion of M2 that is circulating inside the economy. One would expect that if we limit our monetary measure to only what is available to circulate, we might get a different message when we calculate the velocity. Let's see what kind of a difference it makes. We can see it makes a pretty big difference. When we exclude the part of the broad money supply that is not available for circulation, we can see that velocity really hasn't fallen off a cliff at all. It's a little lower than it was in the late 90s, but it hasn't fallen off a cliff as the raw velocity data would indicate that it has. The population as a whole is turning over the money in circulation at a healthy clip. In other words, it's still spending the money that it already has. The plummeting nature of velocity that we saw in the raw data was simply telling us that the new money created by the Federal Reserve has zero velocity. It's simply not being lent out. This will lead us to some very disturbing conclusions, just not the ones that were apparent on the surface. We'll need to dig a little bit deeper to get to the heart of the matter. First, though, we'll have to examine how what the modern economists call money, or more accurately, credit, comes into existence. Bear with me for a little bit because I think you'll agree that the discussion is going to be worthwhile. What you see here is an illustration of the Mandrake mechanism. It's the process by which the Federal Reserve, in conjunction with the federal government, create fiat money. The discussion I will provide here will be very brief, so if you want some more detail, I'd suggest you go out and watch a video series made by Mike Maloney called The Hidden Secrets of Money. It's a more in-depth discussion. I believe Mr. Maloney discusses the Mandrake mechanism in episode 4 of the series. One thing I would like to warn you about, though, is that most precious metals advocates, including Mr. Maloney, who discuss the topic, tend to leave out a very important factor that I will touch on in this video. It's an omission that I'm afraid leads to some very faulty conclusions. So watch my explanation here and then go out and get some more detail. Just keep in your mind the extra factor that I point out here in this video, and then you can draw your own conclusions. In brief, the way the system works is that base money is created when the federal government deficit spends. The government is always buying more goods and services than it brings in taxes. The money needed has to come from somewhere. So the government sells bonds. These bonds that are sold in exchange for current money hold the promise of paying back more money in the future. Quite a few of these bonds are sold to the public and to foreigners, and what can't be sold is purchased by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve simply creates a credit and then takes the bonds onto its balance sheet. Voila! Base money is created inside the banking system. One would question why this money created out of nothing has any value at all, and would be correct in asking that question. Well, that's the reason why the 16th Amendment of the Constitution, the one that gave the federal government the power to levy an income tax, was passed at the same time that the Federal Reserve System was created. You see that taxpayer that I put in the upper right-hand corner? Well, he is partly what gives the base money its value. When the federal government issues a bond, it is obligated to come up with the base money to pay the bondholder the principal plus the interest. Because of the 16th Amendment, this becomes an implicit obligation on the part of the taxpayer. So the taxpayer, if he wants to participate in the economy, must pay a percentage of his income in Federal Reserve notes to the U.S. government. It is this demand for dollars that is partly the source of the dollar's value. Now, there are other factors that give the dollar its value. For example, oil trade is conducted in dollars, but that's a subject that I've covered in many other videos. For now, let's stick to the Treasury debt market as the source of the demand for the dollar. This is it in a nutshell. This is what you see covered in many of the other more comprehensive videos. The two key things that you need to know are, 1, what we call base money in the system today is brought into existence because the federal government spends more money than it takes in taxes. And 2, it is the implicit obligation of the taxpayer to service this debt that gives the dollar its value, at least when we exclude other factors such as the petrodollar system. One thing that is interesting we can note by taking a look at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve is that it has actually contracted over the past 3 months by about $500 billion. Base money has fallen from $4.2 trillion in October down to $3.7 trillion today. Should this be a big concern to us? Well, most of the commentators who discuss the Federal Reserve System would say absolutely yes. They will state that when the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the U.S. Treasury, it creates the money to pay only the principal portion of the bonds. But the bonds themselves require the payment of both interest and principal. So most presentations on this subject will state that there will always be less base money in the system than is required in order to pay off the obligations to the Federal Reserve. While on the surface this is an attractive argument, especially for a sound money advocate, it is not strictly correct. And please bear in mind that I'm not a proponent of our current system of money, but I do strive to understand it fully. Without a full understanding, it's very difficult to explain what is going on in this economy of ours, much less to predict it. So I think we're all well served to try to understand the rules. And this brings me to the key element that is often overlooked by the makers of videos that discuss the Federal Reserve System. And that is that any and all profit that is generated by the Federal Reserve System must be credited back to the U.S. Treasury. So a very small portion of the interest payments on the bonds owned by the Federal Reserve is used to pay salaries and other expenses, but the vast majority of it goes right back to the Treasury. So in a sense, the Treasury really doesn't technically pay interest on the bonds that are on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. The money borrowed from the Federal Reserve is essentially interest-free. Thus, there will always be sufficient base money to pay off the Treasury obligations owned by the Federal Reserve. The myth that the money supply cannot contract is just that. It's a myth. If the political will exists to contract the base money supply, then it can certainly be accomplished without causing the federal government to go bankrupt. Now that's not to say that the political will exists. It certainly does not. I'm just pointing out that it can be done, and knowing how the system works and what the options are can help us to avoid making incorrect assumptions that might get us into trouble. Up until now, we've only been talking about base money. We haven't even talked about where broad money comes from, but we'll need to talk about it if we're to make sense of what's going on with broad money growth and money velocity. Remember how I said that base money is created when it is borrowed into existence, and the money's value is derived from the fact that there is someone who is on the hook to pay back the debt? Well, the same mechanism is in place in the private sector of the economy. Imagine now that instead of having a federal government borrowing funds from the Federal Reserve Bank to fund deficit spending, we have the population as a whole, including corporations, who borrow funds from the banking system to fund spending that is in excess of income. It doesn't matter if the people in this picture are borrowing money to buy consumer goods such as cars, or taking out mortgages to buy houses, or borrowing to build plant and equipment. The key is that there's a desire on the part of the people to spend now and pay back the money borrowed at a later time. When this borrowing takes place, it creates what the system refers to as broad money. All of this money is really just credit, but the system treats it like wealth because of the obligation that it represents on the part of the borrowers to earn the money over time and pay back the loans. So where does the money come from that's borrowed? Well, the majority of the base money is lent out. As soon as that money that's lent out is spent, it becomes someone else's deposit in the banking system, and then that money itself can also be lent out. This is the mechanism by which fractional reserve banking can generate broad money that's many times that of the available base money. How much broad money can be generated from a certain amount of base money? Well, it depends upon the reserve requirement set by the Federal Reserve. With a Federal Reserve requirement of 10%, broad money can be up to 10 times that of the base money available. And 10% reserve requirement is what's advertised by the Federal Reserve. However, for years, banks have used a loophole called a sweep to avoid having to comply with the reserve requirements. So for all intents and purposes, we can consider the reserve requirements to be zero. So why is it that the banks have not created unlimited amounts of borrowed money? Is it even within their power to do so? The answer to that question is no. Now, I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for what I'm about to say, because it goes against the grain of what many commentators in the precious metals world teach us about the banking system. But that's okay. All I ask is that you consider this with an open mind. If you do so, I'm convinced it will open your eyes to a new way of viewing the system, which will be much more consistent with observable trends. So here it is. The banks are not the ones who create the money. It is the people who create the money. When the population as a whole decides to borrow, it's as if they are pulling future productivity into the present so that it can be spent now. The banks are only there to act as judges of credit, to keep account of all of the liabilities generated, and to act as loan servicers. In return, they are paid a portion of the interest. Too large a portion in my opinion, but that's beside the point. It is the people who create the credit which we call money. If people have good prospects, good credit, and they want to borrow from the future, then when they do so, they generate the credit that we mistakenly call money. But when the people do not have good prospects, or have poor credit, or simply no desire to borrow, there is nothing that the banking system can do to expand the money supply. Now, what I've just told you is probably very different from what you've been told by other precious metals advocates. Give it some time to sink in, though. Hit pause for a little while if you have to, or play this video until the end and then replay it if it helps. But let me reiterate the most important stuff. The source of modern money is people borrowing in order to pull future production into the present. It is this pull from the borrowers that creates the money and not the push from the banks. The banks simply keep track of accounts, judge creditworthiness, and collect the money. They are well compensated for carrying out this task. As much as the banks want to, they can't create the money without the ability and the willingness of the people to borrow from the future. The value of the credit instruments that we call money is based upon the ability of the borrowers to honor their obligations. So with that out of the way, let's get back to our economic trends and talk about the disturbing trend that I told you I found. Now that we have discussed that what we call money is really just debt, let's just take a look at some trends in debt levels to see what is happening with our money. Here is a long-term trend of total U.S. debt. It currently stands at about $58 trillion. 50 years ago, total debt was only $1.1 trillion. So total debt in the U.S. has increased on average by 8.5% per year for 50 years, and is currently over 50 times what it was 50 years ago. Overall, we're looking at a very large change in total debt levels. Of course, some of this is federal debt and some of it is not. Let's take a look at the trend of both. Here's a green line showing the total federal debt. Notice it's grown quite a bit from where it started 50 years ago. It currently stands at $18 trillion, which is large, but still only about 30% of the total debt. When we subtract the federal debt from total debt, we can see how much money has been borrowed by consumers, corporations, and state and local governments. This is shown as the blue line. Now, it's the blue line that's very interesting to us from the standpoint of understanding the economy as it stands, aside from the federal government activity. It is the borrowing at this level and the expansion of debt which represents the great majority of broad money creation. Notice something about this curve that looks a little scary? I'll give you a hint. It's the portion of the curve after the year 2008. The flatness of the curve beyond this date is very important. If we break the curve into segments, we can see how dramatic the slowdown in non-federal debt growth has been recently. Even in the slowest decade, between 1985 to 1995, the debt grew at a pace of 8% per year. In other years, the rate of non-federal debt growth was even higher, averaging close to 10% per year. But something happened in the year 2008. Non-federal debt stopped growing. In fact, it's actually been slowly contracting. Why is this such a big deal? Well, consider this. From 1995 to 2008, non-federal debt was growing at a pace of 9.3% per year. At the end of this period of time, the total non-federal debt was $40 trillion. This means that in early 2008, the debt was growing by about $3.7 trillion per year. As I've said, the way to interpret this borrowing is that it is the population deciding to borrow from the future production to fund present consumption and present lifestyle. So this $3.7 trillion worth of borrowing created a lifestyle that was $3.7 trillion per year richer than it otherwise would have been. US GDP at the time, which, as you recall, is a measure of the total number of transactions, was only $14.7 trillion per year. So if we subtract the $3.7 trillion of excess consumption due to debt growth from this number, we're left with only $11 trillion of economic activity that was not funded with borrowed money. 3.7 trillion out of the 11 trillion is 34%. So we may conclude that in early 2008, the economy was 34% larger than it otherwise would have been without all the borrowing. If we take a look at earlier periods on the chart, we can easily conclude that the economy has felt much bigger than it otherwise would have been, simply because the participants in the economy had good credit, good prospects, and were willing to borrow against the future. And it has been this way for a long, long time. But in 2008, something changed. For some reason, the people stopped borrowing. It was either a loss of confidence, a dramatic decline in their prospects, or they simply ran into the limit of what they could possibly borrow. I happen to think that it was the last of these that was the problem. After all, interest rates have been near zero for many years, and it hasn't inspired people to borrow more. The trouble with debt is that it not only comes with the penalty of interest, but eventually you reach a point where just keeping up with the required principal payments creates a big burden. Now, as I've said, the economy felt much bigger than it otherwise would have been without all the debt growth. This creates a big challenge for the political class, who needs the economy to grow to stay on the good side of the population. The authorities would very much have liked to have seen this trend in non-federal debt growth instead. The dashed line represents what would have happened to the debt growth levels if the population had continued to borrow at 9.3% per year. Notice there's a very big gap, and this is precisely the type of gap that the Keynesian economists think can be filled with government spending. And they did try to plug the hole with fiscal stimulus programs. The solid green line represents federal debt over time leading up to the present. Had the growth rate in government spending leading up to 2008 been maintained as it was, which at the time was about 5%, the federal debt would have followed the dashed green curve instead. But the government went on a spending spree and borrowed much of the funds from the Federal Reserve. This increase in activity is represented by the gap between the solid and the dashed green curves. Notice how, as reckless as the extra spending on the part of the government seems to be, it is grossly insufficient to even come close to filling the gap that resulted from the slowing borrowing activities of the private sector. And this is the reason why all of the base money created is just sitting on deposit as excess reserves. The private sector is simply not borrowing, and it is making the economy feel much smaller than it felt before 2008. What remains to be seen is what will happen in the future. As the economy continues to contract, it is going to create downward pressure on prices and downward pressure on employment rates. This will make debt harder and harder to pay off. If a point is reached where mass bankruptcies occur, then the credit, which we call money, will simply vaporize. This will eradicate the quote-unquote wealth of those holding these debt obligations. If, on the other hand, the government or Federal Reserve does something unprecedented to try to spur on debt growth, then the confidence in the dollar could be completely undermined, which will more or less socialize the credit losses across the entire population. On the one hand, we have what modern economists refer to as deflation. On the other, we have inflation. Both are two sides of the same credit market failure coin. We'll have to wait and see what happens. In the meantime, I'll be waiting this one out on the sidelines, with a healthy stock of what I personally consider to be the ultimate money.